Welcome back. In part 2, our story continues through decades filled with new challenges, shifting borders, and struggles that shaped the generations ahead. Let's pick up where we left off and see how the conflict deepened. The guns fell silent in 1949, but a lasting peace remained elusive. The newly established state of Israel was not recognized by its Arab neighbors, except gradually by Jordan regarding its new borders. The 1949 armistice lines were not formal borders, just ceasefire demarcations, a fact that left key issues unresolved. Jerusalem was divided. Israel held the western parts of the city, while Jordan held the old city and eastern neighborhoods. Barbed wire and walls ran through the heart of Jerusalem. Holy sites like the Western Wall fell under Jordanian control. Israeli Jews were barred from their sacred sites, and Jewish cemeteries on the Mount of Olives were desecrated. Conversely, Palestinians who had fled West Jerusalem or other areas now in Israel were not allowed back to their homes, which were occupied by new Israeli immigrants. From 1949 to 1967, no Palestinian state arose. The West Bank, including East Jerusalem, was annexed by Jordan. Its Palestinian residents granted Jordanian citizenship, but effectively under Hashemite rule. The Gaza Strip was administered by Egypt, which, however, did not annex it or grant Gazans Egyptian citizenship. Instead, Gaza's large refugee population lived under Egyptian military governance, yearning to return home one day. In these years, the Palestinian national cause was largely championed, or some would say hijacked, by the surrounding Arab states. The conflict simmered in other forms. Along the armistice lines, Fedayeen guerrillas from the refugee camps occasionally infiltrated into Israel to harass or reclaim property, and Israel often responded with reprisal raids. These tit-for-tat incursions kept tensions high and occasionally flared into larger clashes. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was one flashpoint. Israel, allied with Britain and France, invaded Egypt's Sinai after Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Israeli forces swiftly captured Gaza and Sinai, showcasing Israel's growing military might. Under intense U.S. and Soviet pressure, however, Israel withdrew in 1957. Notably, the 1956 war brought the plight of the Palestinians into sharper focus. In the Gaza Strip, still packed with refugees, an Israeli unit committed the Kafr Qasim massacre on the eve of the war, killing 48 Arab civilians inside Israel, an event that underscored the precarious position of Arabs under Israeli rule. It was also in this period that the Palestinians began to organize independently. In 1964, with backing from Egypt's Nasser, the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, was founded. The PLO's initial leaders were Arab government appointees, and its charter called for the liberation of Palestine and destruction of Israel. At first, it had little autonomy, but this organization would soon take center stage as the voice of Palestinian national aspirations. History, however, was about to accelerate and dramatically reshape the conflict's parameters in 1967. By the mid-1960s, the Middle East was a tinderbox of nationalist fervor, ideological rivalry, and great power intrigue. In June 1967, it exploded. The events of that year, known as the Six-Day War, would radically alter the map and fate of Israel-Palestine. Mounting tensions set the stage. Syria and Israeli forces skirmished over the Golan Heights. Palestinian guerrilla attacks from Syrian and Jordanian territory were on the rise, now often led by Fatah, Yasser Arafat's faction within the PLO, and Egypt's President Nasser, champion of pan-Arabism, ramped up bellicose rhetoric. In May 1967, Nasser took a fateful step. He expelled UN peacekeepers from Sinai and blockaded the Straits of Tiran, cutting off Israel's Red Sea access. Israel viewed this as a casus belli. Amid regional mobilization and threats to drive Israel into the sea, Israel's government decided to strike first. On June 5, 1967, the Israeli Air Force launched a sudden preemptive attack, decimating the air forces of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan on the ground. With air superiority assured, Israeli troops swept to stunning victories on 3 fronts in just 6 days. On the Sinai front, Israeli armor punched through Egyptian lines and raced to the Suez Canal. On the eastern front, Despite an earlier Israeli plea for Jordan to stay out, Jordanian forces shelled West Jerusalem. So Israel counterattacked, seizing East Jerusalem and then, in fierce fighting, the entire West Bank up to the Jordan River. Israeli paratroopers entered the Old City of Jerusalem on June 7th, standing before the Western Wall for the first time in 19 years, an emotional high point for Israelis. In the north, Israeli troops repelled Syrian artillery from the Golan Heights and then captured that strategic plateau. By June 10th, the war was over, and the map had dramatically changed. Israel now occupied the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank from Jordan, including East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights from Syria. Israel's victory was swift and total. In 6 days, Israel more than tripled the territory under its control. Jubilation swept Israel. But for Arabs, and especially Palestinians, 1967 was another disaster, called Al-Naqsa, the setback. About 300,000 more Palestinians fled or were displaced in the fighting, many second-time refugees, having first fled in 1948. The entire Palestinian population of Gaza and the West Bank, roughly 1 million people, now fell under Israeli military occupation. Jerusalem, revered by all three faiths, was now entirely under Israeli control. Israel promptly annexed East Jerusalem, extending its law and administration there, a move not recognized internationally. The world watched as jubilant Israelis prayed freely at the Western Wall, even as Palestinian families mourned newly lost homes in the Old City's Muslim quarter or new exiles streamed across the Jordan River. In November 1967, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 242, calling for Israeli withdrawal from territories occupied in the war in exchange for peace and recognition, the famous Land for Peace formula. This resolution, ambiguous in its wording, would become the reference point for all future peace efforts. Israel indicated willingness to trade Sinai back to Egypt and Golan to Syria for peace, but notably not the newly acquired Palestinian territories. The Arab states, for their part, met in Khartoum and declared the three no's: no peace, no recognition, no negotiations with Israel. The Palestinians themselves were not directly consulted. Their fate was, once again, being discussed by others. Meanwhile, on the ground, Israeli settlement building in the newly occupied lands began within months of the war, a process that continues to this day. The first Jewish settlement in the West Bank, Kfar Etzion, was re-established as early as September 1967. Israel treated East Jerusalem as part of its sovereign territory, uniting the city and greatly expanding its municipal borders. Palestinians in East Jerusalem were given a special status, permanent residents of Israel, though not full citizens unless they applied, while Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza became subject to Israeli military administration. Thus, from 1967 onward, the core of the Israel-Palestine conflict became the struggle over these occupied territories and the rights of the Palestinian people living under occupation. The years after 1967 brought no resolution, only a dangerous stalemate. Israel was triumphant but isolated, facing sporadic resistance. The occupied Palestinians chafed under military rule, and the PLO, now based in Jordan and then Lebanon, launched guerrilla raids and dramatic international attacks, like airline hijackings, to press their cause. Arab countries were still angry and hurt about losing badly in the 1967 war. On October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria sprang a coordinated surprise attack on Israel, igniting the Yom Kippur War, also called the October War or Ramadan War. It was Yom Kippur, the holiest day in Judaism, and in the midst of Ramadan, when Egyptian troops surged across the Suez Canal into Sinai and Syrian forces struck on the Golan Heights. The attacking Arab armies achieved complete surprise and early victories. Egyptian soldiers overran the Bar-Lev defensive line in Sinai and advanced into the desert, while Syrian tanks pushed onto the Golan, threatening to descend toward the Galilee. For the first few days, Israel's situation was dire, shattering the myth of invincibility left by 1967. But Israel mobilized reserves and, backed by a massive U.S. emergency airlift of arms, even as the USSR resupplied Egypt and Syria, managed to turn the tide. After brutal tank battles, Israeli forces repelled the Syrians and even advanced within artillery range of Damascus. In the Sinai, General Ariel Sharon led a bold maneuver, crossing the Suez Canal to the African side, encircling part of the Egyptian Third Army. After about 3 weeks of intense combat, a UN-brokered ceasefire took hold by late October 1973. Both sides claimed moral victory. Egypt had avenged some of the shame of 1967 by proving Israeli forces were not invulnerable, and Israel ultimately repelled its enemies and even gained a new forward position in Egypt before the ceasefire. But the cost was heavy. The 1973 war was far bloodier than previous ones, with over 2,500 Israelis and perhaps 8,500 Arab soldiers dead. Civilians also suffered, and the war's shock triggered a global oil crisis when Arab states imposed an oil embargo. Most importantly, the 1973 war jolted the political landscape. It led directly to a historic breakthrough. Egypt's new president, Anwar Sadat, concluded that a military solution was untenable and that only diplomacy could regain Egypt's lost Sinai. The United States, under Henry Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy, helped negotiate disengagement agreements. Finally, in 1977, Sadat dramatically broke the psychological barrier by visiting Jerusalem and speaking before the Israeli Knesset, signaling a willingness to make peace. This paved the way for the Camp David Accords of 1978. Under U.S. President Jimmy Carter's mediation at Camp David, Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin struck a framework for peace. The resulting Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty, signed March 1979, saw Israel agree to withdraw fully from the Sinai Peninsula, dismantling all Israeli settlements there, in return for Egypt's full recognition of Israel and a peace agreement. This marked the first Arab country to make peace with Israel, shattering a pan-Arab taboo. Israel returned Sinai to Egypt by 1982, gaining a secure southern border. The Camp David Accords also included a vague outline for resolving the Palestinian issue, calling for a 5-year autonomy plan for the West Bank and Gaza and negotiations over final status. But notably, no Palestinians were direct signatories, and the PLO bitterly opposed the separate peace. In fact, Egypt was ostracized by many Arab states for abandoning the Palestinian cause. While the Egypt-Israel Treaty removed the strongest Arab military threat to Israel and brought a cold but lasting peace, the Palestinian question remained unanswered. Israel continued to control the West Bank and Gaza, and Jewish settlements in those areas kept growing. The PLO, now recognized by Arab states, in 1974 the Arab League declared the PLO the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, intensified its struggle from exile, setting the stage for a shift of the conflict's focal point back to the Palestinian arena. Through the 1960s and 70s, the Palestinian national movement took shape, often in fire and blood. The Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, though formed in 1964 under Arab League auspices, truly came into its own after the 1967 defeat discredited reliance on Arab regimes. Yasser Arafat, the leader of the militant Fatah faction, became chairman of the PLO in 1969. The PLO adopted guerrilla warfare and terrorism to put the Palestinian cause on the world map. Throughout the 1970s, PLO groups carried out cross-border raids into Israel and high-profile international attacks, hijacking airliners, taking hostages, and tragically, at the 1972 Munich Olympics, a PLO faction, Black September, killed 11 Israeli athletes. The PLO's actions were condemned by Israel and the West as terrorism, but to many Palestinians and other colonized peoples, they symbolized a fight for liberation when all else had failed. The PLO had a tumultuous journey. After 1970, it was expelled from Jordan following a civil war, Black September, with King Hussein's government, and it relocated to Lebanon, where it established a quasi-state in the southern part of the country. From there, PLO fighters launched attacks into northern Israel, which in turn prompted Israeli retaliations and eventually a full-scale Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 to crush the PLO. The Israeli army reached Beirut and besieged Arafat and his fighters. Under international pressure, the PLO evacuated Lebanon, moving its base to Tunisia, far from Israel's borders. But even as its armed units were scattered, politically the PLO gained significant ground. In 1974, the Arab League recognized the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of Palestinians, and the UN granted the PLO observer status. Arafat addressed the UN General Assembly in 1974 with his famous olive branch speech, a sign that the Palestinians had emerged as a distinct actor on the world stage, no longer simply as refugees to be absorbed or a footnote to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Throughout, Israel adamantly refused any dialogue with the PLO, which it branded a terrorist organization dedicated to Israel's destruction. The PLO covenant indeed called for replacing Israel with a secular Palestinian state. But the reality of millions of Palestinians under Israeli rule after 1967 and the persistence of the PLO's armed struggle kept the conflict very much alive. By the 1980s, a new generation of Palestinians under occupation was coming of age, and they would soon take matters into their own hands in the territories, shifting the conflict's locus inside the West Bank and Gaza. On December 9, 1987, an incident in Gaza sparked a flame that quickly spread throughout the occupied territories, a flame of popular uprising. A traffic accident, an Israeli military truck collided with a car, killing 4 Palestinian laborers, acted as a trigger for pent-up frustrations in Gaza, which had been under Israeli occupation for 20 years. Crowds of angry youths took to the streets, throwing stones at Israeli checkpoints and soldiers. The unrest spread like wildfire to the West Bank and East Jerusalem. This was the beginning of the First Intifada, Arabic for shaking off, a grassroots Palestinian uprising against the Israeli occupation. Unlike the PLO's external armed attacks, the Intifada was largely local and spontaneous at first. It involved mass demonstrations, stone-throwing protests by teenagers, commercial strikes, graffiti, and civil disobedience. Palestinians boycotted Israeli goods, refused to pay taxes, and erected barricades in refugee camps. Women and children joined in large numbers. The imagery of young Palestinians facing off against heavily armed Israeli soldiers and tanks was broadcast worldwide, fundamentally shifting international perceptions of the conflict. The Intifada was not entirely peaceful. Molotov cocktails and the occasional firearm were used, but predominantly it was unarmed or low-level resistance by an occupied civilian population. Israel's military, unprepared for a people's revolt, responded with force. Live bullets in some cases, tear gas, mass arrests, and a controversial broken bones policy to crush protests. Over the 6 years of the First Intifada, more than 1,100 Palestinians were killed, many by live fire, and hundreds of Israelis were killed as well, including soldiers and civilians, some lynched by mobs or in terror attacks. Notably, about Israeli 160 civilians and soldiers lost their lives in the Intifada's early years, a lower toll than later conflicts, but impactful on the society. Politically, the First Intifada was a game-changer. It revitalized Palestinian nationalism on the ground. Local leadership emerged through popular committees and an underground command linked loosely to the PLO, the Unified National Leadership. Under the pressure of the uprising, the PLO in exile took significant steps. In 1988, Arafat and the PLO formally recognized the State of Israel's right to exist and accepted a two-state solution, effectively endorsing UN 242 and renouncing terrorism, at least rhetorically. That same year, the Palestinian National Council, the PLO's parliament in exile, declared an independent state of Palestine, symbolically in Algiers, referring to the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem as its territory, though of course Israel controlled those areas. Many countries extended recognition to this state of Palestine on paper. On the Israeli side, the Intifada prompted a segment of the Israeli public to question the long-term viability of ruling over a hostile Palestinian population indefinitely. Peace movements like Peace Now gained momentum, and even some former Israeli generals advocated for negotiations. However, Israeli society was also polarized. Others called for tougher measures or more settlements to solidify control. Internationally, the Intifada and the end of the Cold War created new diplomatic openings. The United States, under President George H.W. Bush, convened the Madrid Peace Conference in 1991, bringing Israelis, Palestinians, as part of a joint Jordanian-Palestinian delegation, and neighboring Arab states to the table for the first time. Direct dialogue began, albeit slowly and painstakingly. The early 1990s ushered in an era of cautious hope, a belief that this decades-old conflict might be resolved through compromise. In 1993, after secret negotiations in Oslo, Norway, Israeli and PLO representatives achieved a breakthrough. Yitzhak Rabin, Israel's prime minister, a former general who had ordered tough tactics in the Intifada's early days, and Yasser Arafat, once branded a terrorist, agreed to mutual recognition. The PLO formally recognized Israel's right to exist in peace and security, and Israel recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. The result was the Oslo Accords, a declaration of principles signed in Washington, D.C. on September 13, 1993, with U.S. President Bill Clinton famously watching Rabin and Arafat shake hands on the White House lawn. Oslo I, 1993, and a follow-up Oslo II, 1995, outlined a peace process, a 5-year interim period during which a Palestinian Authority, PA, would be established to govern parts of the West Bank and Gaza, with final status issues, Jerusalem, refugees, settlements, borders, deferred to later negotiations. In essence, Israel agreed to withdraw its forces from the main Palestinian population centers. The Palestinian Authority, led by Arafat, would take over administration and security in those areas. A. Under full PA control, B. Under PA civilian control and joint security. The PLO committed to stop violence. Israel, to gradually redeploy. Gaza and the West Bank town of Jericho were the first to be handed over in 1994. The Accords envisioned that by May 1999, a final peace treaty, including the creation of an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel, the two-state solution, would be concluded. The Oslo Accords raised tremendous hopes among moderates on both sides and in the international community. For Israelis, it promised recognition and security, an end to being occupiers. For Palestinians, it promised an end to occupation and a path to statehood at last. The world poured billions into supporting the newborn Palestinian Authority. Arafat and the PLO leadership returned from exile to establish themselves in Gaza and Ramallah. The everyday lives of Palestinians in cities like Nablus and Gaza City briefly improved as checkpoints were removed and they governed themselves for the first time, albeit in fragmentary enclaves. Yet, Oslo's glow was short-lived. Extremists on both sides sought to derail the process. In February 1994, a Jewish extremist massacred 29 Palestinian worshippers in Hebron's Ibrahimi tomb of the patriarchs. In retaliation, Palestinian Islamist groups, notably Hamas, which had been founded in 1987 during the Intifada as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, and which vehemently opposed Oslo and Israel's very existence, began suicide bombings targeting Israeli buses and cafes. These horrific attacks killed dozens of Israeli civilians, terrifying the Israeli public. Still, Rabin's government pressed on with peace steps. But in November 1995, tragedy struck peace's champions. Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli right-wing extremist opposed to territorial concessions. Rabin's death was a seismic shock. His successor, Shimon Peres, lost the next election in 1996 to Benjamin Netanyahu of the hawkish Likud, who had been a fierce Oslo skeptic. Meanwhile, Palestinians grew disillusioned as well. They saw Israeli settlements doubling during the Oslo years, and many roadblocks remained. Final status: talks dragged on unresolved. Life under the PA also had its problems. Arafat's administration grew corrupt and authoritarian, and unemployment and poverty remained high. By 2000, trust was badly frayed. That summer, U.S. President Clinton convened Camp David talks between Arafat and Israel's new PM Ehud Barak to reach a final peace. They deliberated intense proposals for 2 weeks, discussing how to partition Jerusalem, how to carve a Palestinian state out of nearly all the West Bank/Gaza with possible land swaps, how to address the refugee issue. But Camp David 2000 ended with no agreement. Each side blamed the other. Israel claimed Arafat rejected a bold compromise. Palestinians said the Israeli offer denied them a viable sovereign state, and East Jerusalem sovereignty. The summit's failure and mutual recriminations proved perilous. Within weeks, a spark would ignite a far more violent conflagration. In late September 2000, the conflict erupted anew, fiercer and bloodier than before. The trigger was a visit by Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon to Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, Temple Mount. On September 28, 2000, perceived as highly provocative by Palestinians. Protests by Palestinians in Jerusalem escalated into riots. Israeli police responded with live fire, killing several demonstrators. The anger quickly spread across the West Bank and Gaza. Thus began the Second Intifada, also known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada. Unlike the largely unarmed First Intifada, this round saw much more firearms and explosives. Clashes erupted daily at checkpoints. Palestinian gunmen ambushed Israeli soldiers and settlers. Israel deployed tanks, attack helicopters, and later fighter jets against Palestinian targets. The violence spiraled rapidly. By the end of 2000, dozens of people had been killed. By 2001, hundreds. A horrifying hallmark of the Second Intifada was the wave of Palestinian suicide bombings inside Israeli cities. Militants from Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and later the PLO's own Fatah offshoot, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, dispatched young men and women with explosive belts to blow themselves up in crowded buses, nightclubs, pizzerias, any soft target. Israelis lived in fear. Almost every week brought new carnage. Over the Intifada years, approximately 1,000 Israelis, about 70% civilians, were killed. On the Palestinian side, Israel answered with overwhelming force. The IDF reoccupied cities that had been handed to the PA, like Ramallah, Nablus, and Jenin, in massive raids, notably Operation Defensive Shield in spring 2002, after a particularly deadly bombing during Passover. Urban battles raged. Refugee camps were shelled. Assassinations of militant leaders became routine. Israel killed Hamas's spiritual leader Sheikh Ahmed Yassin in 2004 with a helicopter strike. Israeli forces used airstrikes, armored bulldozers, and snipers in dense neighborhoods, and there were cases of heavy civilian tolls, like the fierce fighting that devastated parts of Jenin refugee camp in 2002. Overall, over 3,000 Palestinians, mostly civilians, were killed in the Second Intifada. The disparity in casualties was stark, fueling Palestinian bitterness and international criticism of Israel's tactics, even as Israelis insisted they were fighting rampant terrorism. The Second Intifada shattered what remained of the Oslo peace process. Mutual hatred and distrust reached perhaps an all-time high. The Palestinian economy and infrastructure were ravaged by closures and incursions. In a bid to stop suicide attackers, Israel began constructing a vast separation barrier, part concrete wall, part fence, snaking in and around the West Bank. A structure that cut off Palestinian villages from their farmland and cities from each other, altering the landscape and daily life profoundly. Checkpoints and roadblocks multiplied. A simple commute became an ordeal for Palestinians. On the Israeli side, every cafe or mall posted guards checking bags. Life went on under the shadow of sudden terror. We'll pause here for now. The conflict was changing, and the next chapter would be just as turbulent. Join us in part 3.